My grandmother has been catatonic for the last 5 years. On the night that Grandpa died, her neighbors called the police to come check on her. They said she was screaming loud enough to be heard 3 houses down, and when the paramedics arrived, she had ruptured something in her throat. Grandpa was dead in the bed they shared, a heart attack, and they zipped Grandpa into that black bag that would take him to the morgue. They carried Grandma out on a stretcher, however. After that, she wouldn't speak, wouldn't move. She just laid in bed and stared at the ceiling of her room in Shady Lane Nursing Home. My grandma, always a strong lady, is fed mechanically. She wears a diaper that an orderly has to change. The physical exercise she gets comes in the form of a physical therapist moving her legs for her as she stays in bed. If she leaves the room, it's because Denise or Reggie, the only 2 orderlies that seem to give a crap about the residents, lift her into her wheelchair and take her outside, or maybe to use the resource center, which is really just a fancy word for the TV room. I begin my story in this way, so you'll know how weird today's events were. I'm a 35-year-old father of 2. I've been married since I was 27 to the love of my life. I thought that after 8 years of marriage and raising kids, nothing could get to me like it did today. I'm sitting at my computer, a bottle of scotch at my elbow, sinking into a fear of returning to my marriage bed. It all started when I went to visit my grandma today. My family has a system. My mom and dad go visit Grandma on Monday. I visit on Wednesday. My little sister Lisa goes on Friday. And we all go to visit on Sunday after church. My wife doesn't go every time, but she comes with me sometimes. She's known Grandma since we were 17, and she remembers her before her current condition. She wasn't particularly close with my grandparents, but I think she likes to be there for me. My grandma and I have always been close. I love my grandma, and I don't want to waste the time I might have left with her. Whether she knows I'm there or not, it's the thought that counts, and I owe her that much. I went on my lunch break today to see her. Reggie was there when I came in. He gave me a big smile as he finished fussing with her pillows. "It always warms my heart to see you and your sister coming to visit the old girl," he said. He let me know her vitals, told me about the doctor's visit she'd had last week, and then he said he'd leave us to our visit. Just me and Grandma. I took out my lunch and made some one-sided small talk as I ate. I had read somewhere that coma patients are aware that someone is talking to them, and in some cases, it sometimes helps them come out of it. Grandma wasn't really in a coma. No one really knew what was going on with her, but I like to think that maybe one day she'd come out of it and thank me for all the lovely visits. She'd say that it was my voice that had kept her going all those years. I'm pretty sure my sister just played on her phone the whole time she was there, and I'd feel like I'd helped Grandma in some way, while she was going through some troubled times. Be careful what you wish for, I guess. I was just telling Grandma about a client I had helped at work when she suddenly inhaled sharply and exhaled in a rattling, skeletal way. I paused, my hand still holding hers as it always did, and was about to get Reggie. Suddenly, the hand tightened spasmodically, and she made another of those rattling breaths, her eyes rolling wildly. She was like a frightened horse looking for an escape, and though it was the middle of the day, I felt a cold chill run through me as she shuddered and gasped in pure terror. "His hands, the hands of the dead," she breathed out. I pushed back suddenly, letting go of her clenching hand. Grandma, are you? Oh, listen to me. I don't have much time, Bug." She was awake. Her face was pale and thin, her hands little more than fleshy claws, but she was awake. She was looking at me in that way that people look at fire exits in infernos, and as I tried to get up, she reached out again and took my hand in her cold, damp embrace. I wanted to get Reggie. Reggie would know what to do, but the naked want on her face held me in place. I knew I wasn't going anywhere. She'd called me Bug. That had always been her nickname for me. And when she said it, I realized how much I had wanted to hear her say it again. "Please, Bug, I need to tell you what he said. You need to know." She was frantic, almost pleading, and my knees sent me down without thinking. This is what she told me. They had been in bed together when it had happened. They were both at that advanced age where laying together was just that. The two were in bed, sleeping, just being with each other, when Granddad had suddenly woken her up. His arms had been around her, her back against his front. I knew from familiarity that this was how they'd slept since they'd been married since they were 17. The position was natural as sleep itself to them. His shuddering had woken her up. His hands were grasping at me. His fingers were together like a pair of mittens, and he was opening and closing like a slow, painful machine. His mouth was against my ear, and his breath was raspy and panting. He sounded like he'd been running, and as he bucked around, I knew he was having another heart attack. Your granddad's health hadn't been good for a while, but as I tried to break free of his arms, he held me tight and leaned his mouth in close. "No, Ellie, don't go, please. I'm scared. I'm scared." He said it, and God help me, he sounded terrified. "Don't be scared, Roy," I told him. "You'll be okay. I'll call Dr. Stevens, and I can't see, Ellie." That's what he said to me. "I can't see. They say you see the light or hear a voice, but I can't see anything, Ellie. It's all just black. All just black. I can't see his face or hear his voice." He gripped me then, hard, and I felt his nails through my nightshirt as he did it. His heart attack was bad, and I was terrified that he wouldn't come through this time. I tried to break free. I tried to get loose, but his arms were so rigid that I couldn't get away. The whole time he's just panting and telling me how there's nothing there, and it's all just blackness, and he knows there's nothing there. He kept right on repeating it, even as his voice went on and on, until finally it just went out, and then he leaned in close until his lips were right at my ear, and he breathed out one final time. That was the first time I screamed. I screamed because I was in the arms of a dead man. He was gone, Bug. He'd breathed his last, and that was that, but now I was caught in his last embrace. Her voice took on a tenuous, hysterical sound, and I remember thinking that somewhere a machine must be going off. Somewhere telemetry must be telling someone how her heart was racing along much too fast. Someone somewhere must be on their way with a crash cart or a doctor or a shot to calm her, because in this room she was close to hysterics. I wanted to get that shot. As many times as I'd prayed to God to hear her speak again, I wanted to see that man come through the door with that shot so she could slip off again. As much as I wanted her back, I knew that this was not okay. At that moment, I just wanted her catatonic again. I wanted this jittery, hysterical creature out of pain. I pulled at his hand, those long hands that would take mine sometimes, and they were hard as stone. They locked in death, and now I could not separate them. His weight was a stone around me, and I was afraid, Bug. I was afraid that I'd never get loose, that they'd find us both dead right there, him of a heart attack, and me of just plain old starvation. Her voice broke, and when she closed her hurting green eyes, I saw the tears spilling out of them. I had to break his fingers. They sounded like dry twigs when they crack in the fire, and after I'd broken 4 of them, I almost had his hands apart. That's when he came back. She whispered this as though he might hear her. Her words made my blood run cold. He'd been dead for 5 minutes, Bug. His chest was close enough that I could feel nothing beating. But all of a sudden, his arms tightened around me, and he screamed in my ear like a wolf in a trap. He pulled me hard against him. I felt my ribs trying to break, and all of a sudden, he was bucking and thrashing like the devil himself had a hold on him. It burns, Ellie," he just kept screaming and screaming into my ear. And when I finally thrust his hands apart, I rolled out of bed and got as far as I could. That's where they found me. They found me in the corner. They found me screaming. I don't know what was burning him, but I saw his last few minutes before he went out again. He writhed, he screamed, and he died in agony. What kind of place could make a man scream like that? I thought to myself, I don't ever want to go to that place. What kind of place could it be? What kind of place? What kind of place? What kind of place? She just kept right on and on, mumbling that phrase again and again and again until I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and ran out as fast as I could. I never looked back. I don't know what I'll do next time I have to see her. I didn't go back to work. I called my boss and told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. He let me. He's a good guy. When I called Reggie later that afternoon, he told me that she was right as rain, as usual. When he'd given her her meds that afternoon, she was still lying in bed, staring at the ceiling as always. He never hinted at any change in the telemetry, never said a word about abnormal vitals, just told me how much he knew it meant to her that I came to visit. Now, I'm sitting at my computer and I don't know what to do. I've been sitting here for about an hour, contemplating how I'll get on with the rest of my life, knowing my grandfather's agony and my grandmother's terror at the end of his life. I've been contemplating how I'll climb in bed with my own wife tonight, a problem that seems to be more here and now. You see, the thought of her wrapping her arms around me, placing her chest against my back, it makes me want to shudder right out of my skin. What would I do if she woke up in the throes of a heart attack? What would I do if she whispered those same hopeless words into my ear as she died? What would I do if I found myself trapped in my own dying love's last embrace? When my parents told me I was going to be sent to take care of my great-grandfather, I was very hesitant. My great-grandfather, Iman Franger, celebrated his 110th birthday in December. Not that anyone had been invited to his party. Actually, there had been no party, because my great-grandfather was a shut-in. He was a famous horror writer, writing and publishing stories since the turn of the century, and he was supposed to have a small fortune saved up. As such, he lived in a Mary Shelley-style house out in the middle of nowhere, toiling away at his latest work of terror. My mother had 5 sisters, and all of them had been trying to get the highly coveted spot in Great-Grandpa's will. But so far, none of my cousins had managed it. It wasn't like I wanted any of his money, but Mom was insistent. She had been after Great-Granddad's money, just like her sisters, since her early adulthood, and now it seemed that her time had finally come around. Since all my other cousins had struck out, this seemed to be her chance. She told me to go and spend the summer, and maybe some of the fall with him, and see how things worked out. Bring some of your writings with you. Maybe that'll get you in good with the old man. And that was how I came to be on my great-grandfather's porch in mid-May, preparing to stay until nearly Halloween. The house was an old 3-story that I knew was nearly a mansion from the few times I'd been there as a kid. There were 8 rooms, 5 bathrooms, a kitchen, a study, and of course, my great-grandfather's office on the 3rd floor. Sometimes you could see him through the large bay window as he sat up there, hard at work at the old typewriter he favored. He had once sat close to the window so that he could look out and perhaps be inspired by the forests or the lawns that surrounded his property. Now, it appeared, he preferred a spot away from such distractions. I rang the doorbell and was unsurprised to hear the lock click open electronically. Great-Grandpa kept no staff. Before I'd been born, a few of his caretakers had turned up missing, and after several searches of the home and property, Great-Grandpa had finally just dismissed his staff and lived alone. He had mostly relied on the kindness of his relatives, or just done without for most of my life. He was very reclusive, and I wasn't really looking forward to spending the next 6 months in his company. I'd been preparing a manuscript to send off for publication, and I figured that I would have little time for revisions if I was too busy tending to my aging grandsire and his monstrous house. Looking back on it now, I see that I really had no idea what was in store for me. The house had a musty look to it, like some old Gothic construction from one of Great-Grandfather's novels. I don't know if this was intentional, but it gave the place a very uncared-for look. I had to wonder what my cousin Leslie had actually done here when he stayed for 8 months last year. The floors were dusty, the drapes in the kitchen were growing a fine crop of mold from a leaky window, and the whole place just had a very dank smell about it. Given the house's age, this was no surprise. The house was well over 100 years old, and had been both my great-grandfather and my grandfather's ancestral home. Now, it was little more than a hulking relic that sat waiting for my great-grandfather to die so some construction company could turn it into a strip mall. A speaker crackled in the foyer, and the buzzing sound made me jump a foot.
Don't just stand around counting the silver. Come up to my study. I have orders for you."
Even at 110, it sounded as though he hadn't lost the steel in his voice. So I climbed up the 3 flights of stairs, wondering how my great-grandfather made it up and down these stairs every day. He must come down to eat, I reflected. He hadn't had anyone to help him since Leslie had left 6 months ago. As my young, sturdy legs made the climb up the creaky old boards, I reflected that I was nearly winded as I came to the 2nd-floor landing. I would soon become quite intimate with those steps in the months to come, though. My grandfather sat in the topmost room, a room that had once been the attic. The 2nd set of stairs had been built just for him, and they were steeper than the original set by far. As I came up the stairs, I could see my grandfather's desk and the battered old wingback chair he had owned since I was a child. The desk and the chair sat in profile, and it was like a scene from a movie. The camera would start a slow pan in and mount the stairs, and the audience would see the back of the red upholstered chair and hear the clicking of the keys. He sat hunkered there like a gargoyle, arthritic fingers tapping away at the keys of his old battered typewriter. The sound was skeletal somehow, like bones against ivory. He kept right on clocking away as I stood a respectful distance behind his chair, not wanting to get off on the wrong foot with this ancient writer that I must share quarters with for the next few months. The attic room was the size of a normal studio apartment and appeared almost Spartan in its furnishings. There was a bed, small and neat, several sagging old bookcases that looked equally as infected with mold, a rug that stretched from the landing to his dark mahogany desk, which sat ever facing into the corner. He had once faced it towards the large picturesque window that looked over his property, but now it looked only into the corner, as though someone had put my ancient grandsire in time out.
"I understand that you are to be my new caretaker."
I jumped a little, the clicking leading me to believe that he would go right on ignoring me for a little while longer. His voice was creaky, raspy from lack of use. I expected to see dust puff out from behind the chair, and when he turned, I decided that my expectations hadn't been far off. To call my great-grandfather ancient would have missed the mark. The man was shrunken to the point of elvishness. He could not have been more than 4 feet tall, and his arms and legs looked shrunken and childlike. His arms were held out in front of him, hands held down at the wrists in a way that made me wonder how much it must hurt him to ride on. His legs hung an inch above the floor as he sat in that monstrous chair, and I remember thinking that he looked like a child sitting in his father's seat. The image was more grotesque than humorous, however.
"You should know that I have high expectations for my helpers. I give no special treatment for family members. Your life here will be hard, but focus on the silver lining. You might just manage to acquire that oh-so-coveted spot in my will that my children and my children's children and now my children's children's children seem so incapable of garnering. Anything is possible, I suppose." And when he shrugged his shoulders, I imagined that I could hear them grind together. Listening to him talk was like watching a particularly talented bit of ventriloquism. His accent was plummy, cultured, and far too deep for the child-sized creature residing in that throne. I expected someone to poke their head out from the back of the chair any minute now, and laugh, saying how they had gotten me. When we both ended up staring at each other for the next few seconds, and no grand revelation was revealed, he went on. He told me about his meal schedule first. He ate breakfast at 5, lunch at 11, and dinner at 6. He subsided almost entirely on Campbell's soup, of which he had a large supply in the pantry. There were 7 different flavors of soup, one for each day of the week, and every month there was a number I would call to have more delivered. He told me that I could make a list of food I wanted as well, and that they would be delivering it to the house with the order. "Just keep the bill under $500 a month," he droned. "I would like to remain in funds until I die."
He bathed every night at 7. While he assured me that he didn't need help bathing, he would need help getting to the bathroom, into the tub, out of the tub, and back to his room. I was to put him in the tub and then leave until summoned again. He would be fully dressed again, and when I arrived, I would help him back to his room. His schedule, other than that, seemed to be writing. He wrote sometimes for 18 or 19 hours a day, and would often write well into the night if the mood took him. He rarely slept, he told me, and I would likely find him napping in his chair if I needed something early in the morning. He slept most often between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. I was not to disturb him or make any noise between those hours whatsoever.
When you're my age, you find you just don't need to sleep as much as normal people. But I won't have the little that I do get disturbed by your needless clatter.
My duties, other than feeding and bath time, were my own.
I would like the house swept once a week, the windows opened once a week to air out the dust, the drapes taken down and washed once a month. I have a sneaking suspicion that feckless cousin of yours didn't accomplish any of these things, so it's likely a mess down there. I do not own a TV, nor do I have internet. There is a phone in the kitchen that you may use if you should need to, and while I do have electricity, I expect you to turn the lights off behind yourself. I seem to recall that your cousin Winifred racked up a $400 power bill while staying here, and I ejected her for it. So long as you follow my rules and keep the house, I suspect I will ignore you for your stay here, and you will have no hardships.
He dismissed me after that, and thus began my time in my great-grandfather's house, a time I would come, in later years, to regret undertaking. It first began with the typing. My grandsire hadn't lied. He wrote 18 or 19 hours a day, and the keys of his typewriter were loud. You could hear him typing away from anywhere in the house, and the noise became a constant background drone. Using my hotspot on my phone, I was able to get some writing done, and my proofreading was coming along very well. It was slow, and the signal out here was poor at best, but I plucked away at it as dutiful as I could, despite the distracting sound of all that clacking. The sound almost seemed to scuttle, worming its way into your ears like phantom fingers as you sat trying to concentrate. I tried playing music. I tried using earbuds, but no matter how high the volume, the sound seemed to clatter against my senses like a badly played piano. I began to become rather sympathetic for a certain Poe character, having my own telltale heart clattering at all hours of the night. On sunny days, I would even take my laptop out onto the lawn and get some work done. Though it defied all logic, I imagined that I could hear that typewriter even on the porch or on the way to the mailbox down the lane, easily a half-mile from the house. I know how it sounds, but I also know what I heard, and it invaded not just my waking hours, but my resting hours as well. That's also how the dreams started. Sometimes I would dream that it was me sitting in that big old chair, typing away for hours on end as the words just came sliding up the paper. In my dream, the paper was never ending. It simply rolled on and on as it came out of the typewriter. The words rose like a tree in the forest before my very eyes. My fingers would clack endlessly on the keyboard, my young, strong digits becoming withered like great-grandfathers as I typed my life away. I was always in front of that big bay window as I worked, watching the fireflies out in the woods as they frolicked. Sometimes, though, I would catch a glimpse of myself in the mirrored glass and jolt awake as my great-grandfather's face looked back at me. Then there was the whispering. The whispering had likely been there from the start, but I didn't pick up on it for several weeks. Great-grandpa didn't own a vacuum, so I was stuck sweeping the floors and taking the drapes outside to beat them with a broom. Fortunately for me, carpets were not all the rage at the turn of the century, and Great-grandpa had hardwood floors throughout. I was sweeping the second floor when I heard a spidery whisper coming from the stairs at the end of the hallway. It was nearly unintelligible, the voice the thinnest of whispers, but my great-grandfather was unable to match it in his response.
I won't. You can't make me. You don't even know if he could take my place. It doesn't matter. I won't curse him with the same life I've been cursed with. Stop whispering in my ear and let me finish.
Then came the loud crash of keys resumed, and Grandpa ignored whoever had been whispering to him. I thought about it as I swept, unsure what to make of it. Who had he been talking to? More importantly, who had he been talking about? I knew that he had no phone up there. If he needed something, he always called down the stairs, and the whispering had sounded like it was coming from right inside the room as opposed to a phone. I shook it off as the senile ramblings of the old and troubled man and went about my chores, wanting to get them done so I could return to my own work. That was the first time, but it wouldn't be the last time I heard those whispers. I began to hear them in more than just Grandpa's study as well. They began as something like the scrabbling of mouse feet, a skittery noise that scrabbled across my senses sometimes. The longer I listened, the more I heard, and what I heard was frightening. They whispered about far-off places and foreign hellscapes. They whispered about terrible devils and ancient evils, all of which would win in the end, despite the hero's best efforts. I heard them sometimes in my sleep, a place I could not escape them, and they often filled my dreams with terrible prophecy. The work was literally the third indication that something was amiss. While Grandpa's genre had always been horror, I was more interested in fantasy and YA. My current manuscript was a puff piece, something to get my name on the desk of an agent or a publisher so I could work on more groundbreaking fantasy. My story was good, warring vampire clans and a romance that was trying to blossom amidst the chaos, but it was nothing new. It was a safe bit of YA pseudo-fantasy, the kind that had a built-in audience and was fairly safe. The longer I worked on it inside Grandpa's house, though, the darker the story began to become. Characters began to die more often, backstories became less teen-friendly, and a shadow fell across what had been a fairly light little book up until that point. A lot of my time seemed to be spent fixing changes I had made the day before, and I was getting frustrated with the shifts in tone that seemed to be trying to take place in my story. It was as though someone was also whispering in my ear, telling me to spill blood or inject horror where none was needed. I found my mind wanting to write things that I'd never been interested in before, and the feeling made me uneasy. Then, one morning, I woke up to find my great-grandfather reading some of my editions from the other side of the table. I had fallen asleep at the keys, and when I woke up, I saw his spindly arms scrolling down as he read. It was clear he didn't like using the computer. He made a face every time he had to touch the keyboard, as if putting his fingers on it was something unpleasant. And when he saw me noticing him, he turned the computer back towards me. Then, he did something I'd never seen him do in all the years I'd known him. He smiled.
"You write well, boy. It's a little fluffy for my taste, but it appears that I'm not your target audience. How long have you been writing it?"
I told him I'd been writing my current work for about a year, but I'd been writing in general for most of my life. He nodded, seeming to like the taste of this new information.
"Thought I was the only one, at least since your Uncle Stephen passed."
Then, he slid out of the chair, his feet barely making a sound as they touched the floor, and ambled back upstairs. After that, I seemed to notice him hovering around the dining room often as I made corrections and changes to my manuscript. At first I tried to ignore him, not wanting to make it awkward, but as the weeks tripped by, I asked if he'd like to come help me with my revisions. He declined at first, saying he needed to get back to work. But over time, he actually came to sit with me and helped me labor through the 500 pages of tween trash, as he often called it. Every new revision, the darker ones at least, seemed to interest him, and I found myself taking his suggestions more than I rejected them. Then, one day around Halloween, he invited me to his study. He said there was something he needed to show me. He was standing by the gigantic wingback chair when I arrived. He looked even more like an underfed child as he slid a hand over the arm, his head only slightly taller than the arm of the chair itself.
"You've impressed me, son. Your writing is a little rough, but I suppose that all writing looks rough after a century of it. Many people have asked me how I've lived so long, and writing is the secret to my success. The writing, however, is only half of it. The other half is this." He stroked the chair again as he said it, a look between loathing and loving crossing his face. "Your chair?" I asked skeptically. "Not my chair. This chair was never mine. It was loaned to me on the grounds that I use it for its intended purpose."
"And what purpose is that?" I asked, feeling the hair on the back of my neck prickle.
"Terror," he answered.
I almost expected to hear thunder rumble outside as he made this exclamation. "The chair is meant to spread terror?" I said, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. Great-grandpa didn't seem to notice. He just kept looking at the chair in that loathsomely fascinating way he had. The chair seemed to have him under its sway, and he was powerless to cleave from it.
"The chair is a conduit. Its purpose is simple, to spread fear and to propagate terror. You've heard the whispers by now, I'm sure."
I nodded, hearing them scurry across me even now as I watched my grandfather stroke the old chair that suddenly seemed to be shallowly respirating before my eyes.
From the second I read the changes to your manuscript, I knew it had gotten in your head. It calls to you, just as it called to me, and now it wants to make a deal.
I took a step back from the chair. What are you talking about? A deal? What sort of deal?
You can write forever. Write as much as you want, and your work will make you the kind of money that puts normal men to shame. All you must do is sit in this chair and let it work through you. You can do that, can't you?
I wanted to refuse him, this grinning skeleton in his slowly, but now visibly respirating chair. The longer I looked at it, the more I could see the baleful eyes, the fanning nostrils that were almost snake-like, the grinning mouth that sat in the seat. It looked at me, and as much as I wanted to deny what he was saying as the ramblings of a crazy old man, I couldn't. The chair's glamour had slipped away, and now I could see the monster that lay beneath.
Come sit, he beckoned. Come sit and let it show you its power.
I didn't want to. Sitting on that thing was the last thing I wanted to do, but I found my legs had other ideas. I had moved as if by magic, my legs that of a puppet's on strings. I expressed all my will, but I was a child resisting a hurricane. Great-grandfather moved aside as I came before his throne, and when my bottom slid into that hoary old thing, I expected the teeth to gobble me up. Instead, I was filled with something unexpected. I was filled with completion, a sense of homecoming. I was complete. I saw myself reach for the typewriter, as I had done in my dreams. The whispering beckoned me to write, compelling me to spill my talent for it, and I obliged. The words rolled from me. They weren't mine, not mine at all, but they oozed from my fingers like blood. My words became the click-clacking of the keys. My mind was a chalkboard fit only to be wiped and filled again and again. I was taken over, possessed, and the demon of inspiration capered through me. There was no endless paper now, but I saw the sheets filled and refilled again and again, made full only to be exchanged by another, and as I looked down at the ivory keys, I felt my sanity reassert itself as I saw the stains on that virgin ivory. They were dark, old blood, but they would surely be wetted again. I don't remember passing out, but I remember waking up. I was lying on the bed in my great-grandfather's study. He was sitting on the edge of it, looking even more childlike as his legs dangled. It occurred to me how infrequently I saw him away from his keyboard in all the months I'd been here, and he looked both forlorn and greatly relieved as he watched his withered feet swing.
You did quite well. The first 300 pages of a manuscript that will soon grace the New York Times bestseller list, I am certain. At least, my agent seems to think so. I never have much of a head for popular fiction.
What? But I realized I didn't know what to ask.
It kicks like a mule, don't it, son? I remember the first time I experienced it, back in 36, or was it 26? Who can remember? I was edging towards middle age then, kids out of the house and off on their own, and your great-grandmother had just died of a sudden pneumonia. I was alone in this mausoleum, sure that I had maybe one book in me, but unsure of how to coax it out. The man I bought the chair from showed up out of nowhere, showed up as if I had summoned him, and said he had just what I was looking for. Then he showed me this ghastly hulk you see crouching over there, and I was highly skeptical. My eyebrows slid up even more when he said that it had already been paid for.
He got a dreamy look on his face, as though his mind was casting back through time.
He told me that all I had to do was write, just write, and the chair would do the rest. He told me that the chair would take my writing into heights that no one had ever dared hope, and all I had to do was shake his hand. When I sat down to begin, the man tipped his hat and grinned like an imp. I never looked back. At first, it was thrilling, churning out stories, books, whole series over the course of years. I was detailing my legacy at a breakneck speed. I was like a dragon, looking up to see decades pass by as I sat before my window. His dreamy look became melancholy then, his toes flapping bonelessly as his legs rose and fell like lunatic jackstraws. This is my legacy, boy. This is the inheritance that all my children and all my grandchildren and all my great-grandchildren have struggled for. The money, the house, the land, none of it matters. My inheritance is that chair and that typewriter and a legacy of stunning horror. It is a mantle, and if you chose not to take it up, I would understand. But, and I know from experience, if you don't take it up, you'll drive yourself crazy thinking about what could have been. You'll wonder if the success you have couldn't have been greater, if the joy you felt could not have been more, and if your years upon the earth could not have been better spent.
He looked at me then with such naked hope that I realized what it would mean if I took this burden from him. He would die, but it seemed he was ready to die. His legacy would be mine. The paper would say that the talent ran in the family, and it would continue to run until I passed it on or fell to dust. In the end, I can't even say that I did what I did to save my great-grandfather from his continued suffering. In the end, I did it because he was right. If I didn't do it, I would always wonder what if. He extended his hand to me. The papers are signed and sitting on my desk. The house, the land, it's all yours. Everything. And everything that comes with it, he emphasized. I'm proud to say that my hand didn't shake as I took his. On the third pump of his arm, my great-grandfather turned to dust, and I was left to sit and watch him scatter across the place he loved so much. Then I took my place in the mouth of that great beast and began to write. I would continue to do so for a very long time. It's been so long since I watched my grandsire dissolve before my eyes. In that time, I've been the most prolific horror writer of my age. I've built up money like some old dragon, sitting on my wealth as I hunker on my hill. Sometimes my relatives come to see me, but most times they don't. My own mother refused to talk to me after her great-grandfather left everything to me in his will, but I hardly noticed. She died a few years ago, or was it a few decades? I didn't attend the funeral. Being away from my work for too long makes the whispers less quiet. I travel some, as my grandfather must have done in the beginning, but I never stay away for long. The stories must be told, the conduit must be maintained, and I must remain the keeper of this black lighthouse. It takes a toll, though, to be certain. I understand why my great-grandfather slept so little. If I cannot continue to expel this darkness, it pools inside me, and the vivid nightmares often bring me screaming back to reality. The bags under my eyes have become luggage, and yesterday I glanced up into the window and thought I'd seen a ghost. The old man that looked out from it was withered and sunken, and I thought that Great-Grandpa's ghost had returned to torment me. I see now why Great-Grandfather moved into the corner after a time. I'm not entirely alone, though. My cousins have gone on to have children of their own, and sometimes they send them to me, as I was once sent. One of them, a girl named Katie, is on her way now. I've heard that Katie is a rather prolific poet, and said to be quite talented. We shall see what the chair makes of her. Who knows? Perhaps I might be allowed to stop too before long, and bask in the comfortable blackness that awaits me as well. They say it's a legend, just a story we tell kids, but I'm here to tell you not to believe a word of it. You would do well to beware of the Yule Cat, no matter what they say. My cousins and I grew up in the Icelandic countryside, and spent most of our lives within a stone's throw of our birthplace. For 2 weeks in December, my saintly grandmother would welcome us into her home so my parents could go Christmas shopping or have some time to themselves. She had all my cousins as well, a brood of 8 when we were all assembled, and we made quite a house full. Many nights after Granddad had made his excuses for going off to the pub, Grandma would gather us around the fire and tell us stories. Stories about fairies and Queen Mab and her ilk, and of the elves and darker things that had once been part of this landscape. She told us stories of Icelandic heroes, and filled our dreams with monsters that begged to be slain as we took on our favorite champion's role. But especially around the Christmas season, her favorite story was of the Yule Cat.
He is a giant creature, capable of stepping over palisades and creeping into tall buildings. He punishes the lazy and rewards those who work hard and do their work year-round. If you neglect your duties, the Jorlakaturinn will find your children. Never doubt. His favorite meal is children without new clothes in the winter, their parents having spent their summers at leisure. Thankless children he hates as well, those who scorn their parents' work in favor of frivolous things. So be thankful, my children, that your parents work hard to keep such dark things away.
Most of her stories about the Yule Cat involved naughty children who went into the woods at night, spoiled children whose parents found that the Yule Cat had dragged them out through their window and gobbled them up, and good children who were rushing home on Christmas Eve to get their clothes before the Yule Cat got them. My little brother Sven always held a deep fear of the Yule Cat, but I can honestly never remember a time when I was afraid of him. It always just seemed kind of goofy to me, and in my head I just imagined a giant cat with big wobbly legs that looked like big noodles. Its body was high in the air, and the legs just wiggled around beneath it. I had drawn a picture of it for my grandma once, and she only smiled and ruffled my hair.
Let us hope that if your Jorlakaturinn finds you, he is as silly as you think he is.
I had smiled about the idea of meeting the Yule Cat then, thinking of all the monsters and beasts my cousin and I had slain in our dreams. I'm not smiling as I write this, though. I came to live with my grandparents when I was 15. My father and mother had been killed in a car accident when a semi slid on the ice and hit them head on. They say they died instantly, but all I knew was that Sven and I were suddenly without parents. There was never any question of where we would go, of course. My grandmother opened her home to us without a second thought. With Grandpa 3 years in his grave, she said it would be nice to have some company, and we moved into her earthy little cottage. I lived with her until I was 23, attending university and getting my degree so I could begin a career in architecture. After graduation, I took up residence in my parents' old home so that I could maintain the family homestead. The house was on my grandparents' land, so it wasn't as though I never saw her again. Sven didn't like to go back to the old house, claiming that there were too many memories there, and my grandmother sheltered him quite a bit. When I moved back, I invited him to come live with me, but he declined. He was 17 and showed none of my ambition. I was worried that if he stayed, my grandmother would coddle him forever, but that was his decision to make. I moved back in around Christmas time, and I decorated my old house like it was my first Christmas ever. The lights and decorations were still in the crawl space, like they had always been, and as I put them up, I began to feel a heady sense of nostalgia. The tree stood in full view of the window, and I had bought enough presents for everyone this year. I had spent much of my life not having a lot of money, and now that I had a lucrative job, I decided to take advantage of the holiday season and spoil my relatives a bit. When I was done, my house had shone out against the darkness like a beacon. I was sitting snug by the fire, a cup of spiced hot chocolate in my hand and a slight buzz making my mind slippery, when the phone rang. My grandma's smiling picture showed from the home screen, and I picked it up as I tried to compose my voice. Grandma was used to people being a little drunk, but Granddad had been pickled more than he was sober during life, and I was still at that age where I was self-conscious about her seeing me like that. I answered the phone, and she immediately started with no greeting.
Care, you haven't come to get your Yule clothes. You need to come back now.
I wasn't used to my grandma being so forceful. She was usually very mild, content to smile and let others do what they would, but she seemed upset about this in an irrational way. Tomorrow was Christmas Day. All my cousins and my family and everyone would gather for presents at Grandma's before the usual feast. What Grandma was referring to was her tradition of giving us clothes to keep the Yule Cat away. This was my first Christmas away from home. I usually got them from Grandma when I woke up on the 23rd, but I guess I had missed it since I moved out. Oh, that's okay, Gran. I'll just get them tomorrow. I'll be there with the others. You can give them to me.
No, you have to come get them now, and hurry. I need you here before the sun goes down, or the Jorlakaturinn will get you.
I had rolled my eyes at this. Gran, I think the Yule Cat will understand if I don't want to go out in the snow and get clothes. Can't I just get them tomorrow? Her voice went from severe matriarch to pleading older woman in the blink of an eye.
Care, please. It's your first time away from home, and I want you to be safe. I can leave them on the porch if you don't want to come inside, but please come and get them. She sounded scared, and I couldn't argue. I told her I would get dressed and drive over before sunset, and she sighed in relief and thanked me. I dressed warmly in my snow pants and heavy coat. My muffler and gloves came on next, along with a pair of snow boots and a flashlight just in case. All of this went on over whatever I was already wearing, jeans and a t-shirt and thick socks, and I sighed forlornly as I stepped out in the ankle-deep snow. I put a hand on my old Jeep, but decided against it. My head was a little sloshy, and I knew it would only take a few minutes with the heat blasting before I was asleep and sliding on the icy road. Instead, I decided to walk to Grandmother's house, and it was only about 2 miles from here, in the bracing cold, which would sober me up before I got there. I set off towards the woods that separated her house from mine. Every time I walked those familiar trails, I always felt like I should be scattering breadcrumbs behind me. My grandmother's house lies sheltered in the woods, and they always feel so dense and foreboding whenever I have to walk through them. The snow and the cold made them quiet, the less hardy birds having left, and many of the other animals asleep for the winter. The tracks, however, told me that there were indeed things out here. My legs started to get tired almost at once. If you've never had to slog through deep snow, then I can tell you that it isn't much fun. As the sun began to set, I began to regret not taking the truck. I could hear the snow making the trees creak and sag, and now and again there was a scurry of movement as some small creature went about its business. Other than the occasional noise, it was as though I had the forest to myself, and my loud footsteps made me feel like the last person on earth. When I heard the snow crunch nearby, I swung to see what was there. The sound had startled me. My own feet were the only thing making much noise out here, but I found nothing. By the sound of the crunch, I would have thought it was a reindeer, or maybe a large bird trying to forage below the snow. In the dim light, I couldn't even see where the prints were, and I started slogging a little faster, worried it might be a wild dog or something. The crunching came again, but I shrugged it off as my mind playing tricks on me. When it crunched again, closer this time, I started moving even faster. Going too fast would be a great way to break an ankle or fall and impale myself on a tree limb, but the crunching and lack of a source was starting to freak me out. The snowing sky was already overcast, and the sun was setting behind me. The thought of being out here after dark made my skin crawl. The idea of getting lost in a stretch of wood that would become unnavigatable once the sun went down made me quicken my pace again. My footsteps were loud, cutting through the silence like a foghorn, but somehow I could still hear the steps behind me as I nearly jogged through the ankle-deep snow. What I had thought might be a reindeer or a wild dog now sounded like something much larger. It was very rare, but polar bears sometimes got stuck on ice floes and found their way over here. I had seen something online about it, I thought, and I could just see a big hungry polar bear loping behind me as it prepared to make a quick meal out of me. I didn't dare look back as I heard the crunch come down not 8 feet behind me. It hit the ground hard enough to dislodge snow from the trees, and I started booking it as best I could. What the hell was it? Iceland didn't have a lot of large predators, none that came this close to settled areas, and my mind began to travel back to a time when I was young and sitting warm around Grandma's fire. My cousins and I had always loved the stories about trolls and elves, stories of great heroes who slew the former and were aided by the latter, and we always took up sticks when we played and pretended to swing mighty swords at the knees of ugly, hulking trolls. The idea of being devoured by a large, slobbering troll, my mind showing me the one from Harry Potter, seemed less fun now that I was being chased by one through a fairy tale forest. I glanced behind me in a blind panic, not wanting to see, but wanting to know nonetheless, and I felt my boot sink into a hole. I went down, face first in the snow, and nearly headfirst onto a tree. I rolled over to face whatever was now surely going to get me, preparing to fight. My ancestors had been men who settled this land, men who rode onto the shores in boats with axes and tamed the wilderness, and I would be damned if I would die with my head in the snow like a blubbering baby. What I saw looming over me was no troll. What I saw looming over me was much, much worse. When I had drawn him, I had made his legs look like waving noodles. I had drawn him with a tabby cat coat and a pair of big, friendly yellow eyes. He had been given the Cheshire Cat's grin and a pair of pointy ears that made him look like Batman. He had looked friendly, goofy, something a child couldn't possibly be afraid of. The Yule Cat
was none of those things. His coat was black as twice-baked charcoal, and his bones and muscles seemed to shift beneath it, like they might be something living under his skin. Its legs were long and powerful, like a panther or a jaguar, and its paws left tracks as big as hubcaps, with claws like stilettos. His mouth was filled with 2 big teeth, and the tips seemed to poke at his lips painfully as its slaver ran pink from his jaws. Its ears had been mostly chewed off, sitting on its head like rounded nubs that barely seemed big enough to be ears at all. Its eyes, though, its eyes were the worst. Its yellow eyes blazed like torches, their centers crackling red, and when it loosed a long, loud yowl, I felt my snow pants fill with piss. I was saved by sheer dumb luck. Its yowl had loosed some of the snow from the tree over its head, and when it fell, it coated the Yule Cat's face in a cold blanket of surprise. I rolled away, and when I did, the beast lunged at me. It ran smack into the tree I had nearly fallen into and yowled again. More snow fell on it then, and the cat hissed angrily as its claws shredded the tree to pieces. I didn't wait around to be the next scratching post for this thing. I ran through the snow like a reindeer, churning it up as my fear gave me new purpose. I could see the smoke from Grandma's chimney, but I knew I had to be another quarter of a mile from the house. The shadows were gathering, and I knew that I was dead as soon as this thing got its bearings. When it came after me, I realized it had only been playing with me before. Its crunching step sounded dinosauric, and it cleared the distance between us easily. It swiped at me as I ran, and the claws slid easily through my thick jacket. The back suddenly felt cold as the goose down spilled out of it, and I began to realize that I was running on borrowed time. I had to find some way to lose it. I had to find some way to use its size against it. I needed a place to hide and catch my breath, my lungs burning and my head swimming with exertion. That's when I passed the Himmel tree and realized where I was. When we were children, there was a tall tree that we used as a landmark. We called it the Himmel tree, the sky tree, because it always seemed like it soared up into the clouds. My older cousins and I had hiked to the tree once, nearly a quarter of a mile into the woods, and found that the tree lived up to its name. It was massive, 60 feet of wood like iron, and beneath it was a series of roots that looked like a cage. The soil had pushed away from them, and as kids we would crawl beneath the tree and camp in relative comfort. The spot was large for children, but would be snug for me. I was hoping that it would be too snug for this hellcat as well. I booked it, running flat out as the tree soared up to greet me. I jumped over a sprawl of fallen trees, something I remembered from childhood, and prayed that maybe the cat wouldn't be so lucky. When I heard him hiss and stumble a moment later, I knew that his luck had run out. I didn't look to see how badly he had spilled. I fell on my belly and prayed that I had the angle right as I slid between the roots of the huge tree. I thumped my shoulder, the tough old root hurting as I hit them, but I made it mostly under the tree as the cat scrambled after me. I winced as his claws caught my leg, ripping through my snow pants and jeans to sink into meat, but I shook him off before he could pull me out and was soon snug beneath the wooden canopy of the huge old tree. The underside was just as I remembered it. It was damp from snow run, but the frozen snow had mostly covered it, so I was left in a crystalline world of domed white. The cat screamed in agony, shooting a paw between the roots and searching for me in frustration. I huddled against the side of the tree, not wanting to be found by those furtive claws, and stayed as still and quiet as I could. The scrambling went on for some time, but the cat finally removed its sooty paw. I heard it crunching off into the forest then, lumbering away like a large black shadow as it disappeared into the woods. I stayed still, fearing some trick, but it went right on moving until its heavy footsteps were only slight crunches in the distance. I stayed put though, blowing on my hands as my wet pants and bleeding leg began to make me shiver. I would freeze to death out here if I stayed too long, but I was afraid that the Yule Cat might double back and wait for me to leave. I shivered for as long as I could, feeling the temperature drop as the sun crept closer to down. Finally, I decided I'd rather be eaten than freeze to death. I crawled out, and when I wasn't immediately set upon, I started stumbling towards my grandmother's house. She was waiting in the doorway for me, a mug of spiced cider in her hand, and a concerned grimace spread across her face. "He found you out there, didn't he?" It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. I've been sitting by the fire and letting her feed me and nurse me back to health for a few hours. She bandaged my leg and took my shredded clothes away. She set a plate of food in front of me, and when I finished the spiced cider, she brought me tea and told me to rest. Before she went back to her room to sleep, she dropped a package on my lap. It was a new sheepskin coat, lovely to see and soft to touch. I couldn't imagine what it had cost her, though I knew what it had almost cost me. "He won't bother you now," she said, and made her way to bed as I sat convulsing by the fire. So, heed your elders when they tell you the old stories. I was lucky, but you can't always count on luck. The Yule Cat still lurks in the hills and woods, searching for those he deems ungrateful and underdressed. Don't take the clothes you get for Christmas so lightly, because they could save your life if you find yourself in the sights of the Yule Cat. My granddad's been going through a lot lately. After Grandma died, he kind of went a little mushy. We were asked to come and get him one night after he was found wandering near his house, the police suggesting that we might want to have someone keep an eye on him. Since I was just sitting around the house and doing nothing with my life, my parents extended the idea that this might give me a little freedom since I had recently been chafing under my father's rules. They gave me rules, of course, like no using my grandfather's house for wild parties, no sneaking girls in at all hours of the night, and my grandfather's safety would come first. If we get another call about him wandering off, he will be moving to the nursing home, and you will be moving back home. So, I moved my things in with Grandpa, and we became roommates. Grandpa was a pretty good roommate, all things considered. I lived upstairs in the loft. Grandpa had a loft-style house with a whole other dwelling upstairs. And he lived downstairs since it was hard for him to get up and down the stairs sometimes. I did most of the cooking and cleaning. Grandpa bought the groceries and the beer, though that was our little secret, and we lived in harmony most days. The only thing that kind of annoyed me were the stories. Don't get me wrong, Grandpa has a lot of good stories. He's been in the Gulf War, he'd driven trucks in Alaska on treacherous roads, he'd spent almost all his life in the Appalachian Mountains. In fact, this house had been his childhood home. He had many stories about camping and exploring and roaming the woods around the property. Those I didn't mind hearing so much. There were many nights that Granddad and I would sit on the porch with a case of beer, and he would tell me stories about exploring the woods and discovering its majesty. It was the lies he would tell sometimes that really got to me. He made up some pretty outlandish claims about the woods that I just couldn't shake off. He would claim to have met a Sasquatch, running for his life as it chased him from the part of the woods it lived in. He had met forest spirits and spent a month in their camp as time moved differently there. He had met animal people, spoken with pale, moonlight guardians that lived underground, and many other things. It wasn't just drunken tales either. Those I could have forgiven, but he would ambush me sometimes with these strange little stories. You'd be washing dishes or cleaning the living room or brushing your teeth, and suddenly he'd just be behind you with a tall tale. I mostly rolled my eyes at these stories, but last night he told me something just truly ridiculous. My best friend Ren turned into a tree. I had choked a little on my beer and finally set it down. I was a little drunk, and maybe I shouldn't have let it frustrate me, but these stories were becoming a bit much. I'd heard all manner of stories from Grandpa and just sort of shrugged them off or politely listened to them, but this one was so bizarre that it took me by surprise. His friend had turned into a tree? What the hell did that mean? Your friend turned into a tree, I challenged. Grandpa nodded and took a swig of his own beer. How, Grandpa? Tell me how a person turns into a tree. He looked thoughtful. It's kind of a long story. Are you sure you have time for it? I was off the next couple of days, so I guessed I did. Yeah, I would say I have time for it. Grandpa finished his beer and threw the bottle into the woods, and I heard it break against a nearby tree. This was a habit he had kept from my childhood, and no one seemed to be able to break him of it. The funny thing was that despite him smashing the bottles, I never found any glass in the woods around his house. I always assumed that Grandma had cleaned it up, but it had continued after Grandma was gone. Just one of life's little mysteries, I told myself. And so, Grandpa began his odd tale. When I was about 9, a new boy moved into the valley. His name was Renoir, but I always just called him Ren. His family was from the Bayou, Louisiana, and he was unsure how things worked out in the Appalachians. Still, I was glad for a new playmate, since our closest neighbor was 5 miles in either direction, and we played in the hills and forests around our home. Ren liked to find bugs and small spiders and put them in jars so he could study them. Ren fancied himself something of a scientist, and the Appalachian forests offered him much to explore. Now, the woods were always open to me. Mama never told us we couldn't explore, but Grandma had warned me never to go into the southern grove without her. It was beautiful there. The forest's old and different somehow from the rest of the sprawling valley. I would ask her why I couldn't explore there alone, and she would say that it was dangerous if you didn't know what not to touch and what to leave well enough alone. Like this, she'd say, pointing to a thick, almost honey-like sap that was oozing from a nearby tree. This is the sap of the old calabash tree. You never ever touch it, for if you do, not even I can help you. I asked her why, and she said that her grandma had told her the same many years ago, and she was now telling it to me. It's just one of those rules that we follow. One of those rules we don't question. I had always listened, but Ren was inquisitive. He wanted to explore everything, and he noticed that we were avoiding that particular stretch of forest. I had told him those stories about the places that we weren't allowed to go when we first met. I told him there were 2-headed beetles that lived there. There were strange flowers in technicolor patterns, and the large trees that my grandma had always called calabash. He asked me to take him there, not really feeling comfortable exploring the woods alone yet. He was never far from my side when we were in the woods, and he asked me specifically one afternoon if we could go out there. We were young, 10 at the most, and it didn't take much to convince me. I had tried to remain steadfast, not wanting anything to happen since I never went there without Grandma. But he finally broke me down, and I agreed to take him. But I said that he had to do what I say. Don't touch nothing, I told him, especially if I say so. He promised that he wouldn't, and we set off for the grove. We stopped at his house before we went, and he came back with a backpack that clinked a little as he walked. I had little doubt that it was full of specimen jars and other such things. He may not have intended to touch, but he definitely intended to study. So we made our way to the grove, and as soon as he saw that oddly colored place, he was in love. The grove is a special place, you see. Things there are closer to nature than anywhere else, and Grandma always said it was easy to feel the old world magic that connected the people to the earth, and the people who spend a lot of time there can sometimes hear the voice of the forest that others have forgotten. When Grandma read Robert Frost, she thought that maybe he had found some sort of grove of his own. We spent an hour just exploring the grove. Ren looked at the beetles, putting one into a jar so he could study it later, and sketched some of the plants that he made notes on. I showed him the calabash tree, that massive white gold giant, and I saw the wonder in his eyes that was there every time he found a bug or a leaf he didn't recognize. He approached it, and I understood his need to touch it. I myself had needed to touch it the first time to make really sure I understood what I was seeing. It's the size of it, I think. Your mind tells you that nothing that big can possibly be real, but once you touch it, you just know that it must exist. It wasn't until I saw him take his knife out that I realized what his true intentions were. I ran forward, telling him not to,
but he seemed mesmerized by that golden bark of that towering tree. He wanted some. That much was obvious, but Grandma had always made it very clear that you do not strip the bark from the calabash tree. Wren didn't know. He probably assumed that a tree so large would have plenty of bark. He couldn't have known what lay beneath. As his knife slid easily into the soft bark of the calabash tree, a golden spurt of sap struck him full in the face. He stumbled back, the sap flowing as his knife quivered in the side of that massive trunk, and I saw him clutch his face and scream. I pulled him away from the tree. The roots threatened to trip him, and as his hands came down, I could see that his face was changing. His face was turning brown, his skin thickening, and the pigment of his eyes was beginning to film over as though he was blind. "What's happening?" Wren asked, his voice deepening as his throat stiffened. I didn't know, but I knew what I had to do. I left his bag on the ground, the jars slamming together angrily, and pulled him onto my shoulders. We were both 3 miles out into the woods, but Wren wasn't very heavy. He was small, even for a boy of 10, and I pulled him onto my back and carried him with very little effort. We ran, heading for my grandmother's house. Grandma would know what to do. She would fix him. As I ran, I just knew that if I could get him there, she could save him. We hadn't gone far when he started getting heavy. Like I said, he wasn't large, but I was only 10, and Wren was starting to get really heavy. The boy was light when we left the grove, me walking as I bounced him on my back, but he became heavier and heavier as we walked. His arms hung uselessly at my sides, and his body became like a stone in the center of my back. His legs started to shake as my progress was slowed to a crawl. When I was drawing up short, I thought maybe one of his feet caught on something. I looked back and almost dropped him. His feet had elongated until they dug up behind me, his toes becoming long and searching. They were pushing their way down into the ground, and as I pulled, they attempted to root themselves in the dirt. I pulled him along, trying my best to get him to my grandmother's, but eventually I just couldn't take him any further. We were in a clearing, a stream trickling through that I knew would be a heavy little crossing with the winter flow, and I left him there, saying I would go get help. Wren called me back, though, and asked me to stay with him. I told him that I couldn't do that. If I gave up, he'd be stuck like this. My grandma knew about these sorts of things, and she might be able to help him. I made all kinds of excuses, but in the end, I was just scared. This was so weird, so odd, and my 10-year-old brain didn't know what to do about it. He said, "Please," and asked me to stay, his voice cracking like a branch in a high wind. And after some hesitation, I sat and said that I would. His arms and legs were stiff and bark-like, and he cried tears of yellow sap. I wanted to reach out and wipe them away, but I remembered what that sap had done to him and resisted. His feet were growing, breaking the ground and sliding into the earth as they sought purchase. I asked him how he was feeling, and he said it was very strange. He said that as he grew, everything seemed to slow down, to lighten, and he was filled with an odd sense of eternity. He said he felt ancient and brand new. He felt lonely, yet filled with the knowledge that he was never alone. He felt sad for the life he was leaving behind, but excited for the life that was beginning. The process took about 20 minutes from start to finish, and I sat with him as he changed, not wanting him to go through it alone. His skin thickened, taking on a wooden cast as his legs descended into the earth. His chest expanded, Ren groaning as his bones and his body grew, and his small arms were thrust upward as he reached for the sky. His face and body sort of grew into one, becoming his trunk, and his eyes began to sink into his newly formed trunk body. Much too soon, he was a tree, and I was left sitting beside a half-grown sapling with a pair of expressive rings in its trunk. I was left looking into those way too expressive eyes as he sat looking out onto the forest, never to move again.
I sat there, mouth agape, as Grandpa finished his story. What happened after that? Surely no one believed that he had turned into a tree.
Grandpa shook his head. Only one person. My family and his spent the night searching the woods with a search party from the town. They thought that something had happened to him, and my brain had made up something to cope with it. They could see I was shaken by whatever had happened, and they still wanted to find Ren to make sure he was okay. I tried to tell them, tried to explain what had happened, but my grandma appeared at that moment and wrapped an arm around me. She told them she would watch me while the town searched, and took me into her house for a cocoa. Over cocoa and cookies, she told me that she had tried to warn me about the grove. She said it was a tragedy what had happened, but that was the way of the world sometimes.
He took a last pull off his beer and launched it into the woods.
She said that life was cruel sometimes, but that there was an order. Ren had tried to go outside that order. He had broke the rules, and that cruelty took its revenge. She reminded me that I must never go against that order, not if I wanted to live amongst nature.
I thought about this before shaking my head and telling him I didn't believe it. People don't just turn into trees, Grandpa. He gave me a strange look and just walked into the house. Thought that was the end of the story, but that would be too easy for Grandpa. He woke me up the next morning, about 3 hours before I wanted to be up, and asked if I wanted to meet Ren. It took my fuzzy brain a few minutes to realize what he was talking about before I remembered the story, and asked if he meant the tree.
Yes. Would you like to meet him?
I sighed. I didn't have anything going on that day, so I agreed. We walked into the woods, Grandpa ambling along, and hiked for about an hour into the crisp morning air. For a man in his 70s, Grandpa moved with an odd grace through the familiar woods of his childhood. I suppose he always had, but it was more pronounced now that he was so old. The squirrels and birds were just starting to get noisy, and I could hear the sounds of the forest as we walked. The wind in the trees, the soft noises of small animals in the brush as they avoided the louder sounds of people, the sigh of the leaves as they pushed and pulled towards their inevitable death. Having come here often with my grandparents, I too had become aware of the sounds and tempers of the Appalachian forest. My cousins and I had often found it beautiful and mysterious, but it could be fickle and temperamental too. Just ask my cousin Jeremy, who had twisted his ankle in a hole, only to find that hole was the home of a rattlesnake. If you could ask him, since he'd died while we were getting help. Grandpa led us to a clearing, a small stream bubbling beside it with fresh snow run, and I could see a large, golden-barked tree growing not far from the river. It was towering, probably 15 feet tall, and as I approached, Grandpa shot a hand out and pointed down. I had nearly stepped into a small stream of honey-colored sap that was trickling away from the tree and making its way towards the river.
Don't want 2 calabashes growing so close together, Grandpa chuckled.
He greeted the tree as we approached and came around to its front to touch its trunk. The tree didn't move, didn't speak, but as I came up, I could see a swirl pattern on the front that looked like 2 huge eyes. The eyes seemed to follow you whenever you moved, which was a little unsettling. Though unsettling, the tree looked no different from any other. except for the color and the weird sap. It wasn't until the wind picked up through the branches, shaking the leaves and making them dance, that I thought I heard a creaky old voice say, "Hello, Howard," in response to my grandfather's greeting. We spent some time there, just talking that day. It seems I have a lot to learn from Grandpa's old stories. Maybe I'll tell you some more sometime, if Grandpa's feeling talkative. I don't know if anyone's going to read this. I don't even know if anyone will care. But I have to tell somebody. It's too much to process right now, and maybe if I get some of it off my chest, it will make it easier to handle. I'm getting ready to go into the unknown, and I feel like someone needs to know why. Someone needs to know how it came to all this, and how I came to be a potential murderer/avenging angel. Above all else, I need to tell someone about Charlie. I'd known Charlie since we were in grade school together. Charlie thought of us as brothers, since he didn't have any of his own, and loved us like family. Despite that, never think we were the most important people in Charlie's life. No, the most important person in Charlie's life was his grandmother. Charlie's grandmother, he'd always called her Grandmom, was the one who raised Charlie since the day he was born. Charlie's mother died in childbirth, and his father died before he was even born, so without a guardian, that just left Charlie and his grandmom. Grandmom and Charlie. Charlie's grandmom lived out in the country, in an old wooden farmhouse with a big backyard and acres of fields for growing things. She rented the land to sharecroppers and must have done pretty well for herself, because Charlie couldn't recall a time she'd ever had to work. Charlie didn't have any other family, none that he'd ever met anyway, and for the first 8 years of his life it was just the two of them alone in that farmhouse. Charlie said he remembered being sick a lot as a kid, and most of his earlier memories were he and his grandmom on the couch while she nursed him back to health from one illness or another. Grandmom would sit at home with him while he convalesced, watching Sesame Street and eating whatever Grandmom could whip up in the kitchen. Most days, Charlie would just spend the whole day on her lap while she rocked him and hummed strange little Russian songs to him. Grandmom wasn't originally from here, you see. She had emigrated during the Second Great War, and she and his grandfather had moved out to the country because it reminded her of her childhood home. Coming from the old country, she had all kinds of folk remedies, good-tasting recipes, and strange little songs that she would sing to Charlie as he drifted off to sleep or lay sick on the couch. One in particular that Charlie recalled fondly had become a ritual of sorts, a ritual that goes on to this day, I assume, that took on the normalcy of time and repetition. She would take him on her lap, pull his face close to hers, and place her hands on his cheeks as she put their foreheads together. Charlie recalled the bumpy, veiny skin there beneath his smooth baby skin as she did this, and the warmth that always seemed to radiate from her. With their foreheads pressed together, she would sing a strange song to him in her thick Russian tone before releasing him and planting a kiss on his forehead. "What does it mean, Grandmom?" Charlie would always ask, and the asking was as much a part of the ritual as the ritual itself. "It means," she would say in her warm, gravelly voice, "always together, even when apart, always a part of me, here in my heart." Charlie had never thought it was odd that he lived in relative isolation with his grandmother, not until he started school. His grandmom had tried to homeschool him for a few years, but her teaching wasn't up to the state standards, so she had grudgingly allowed Charlie to attend public school. Here Charlie came into contact with other children, and first learned how strange his situation was. In class, we would do assignments or draw pictures of our family, and Charlie's was always the smallest when put up on the bulletin board with the rest. Charlie began to wonder why he didn't have any uncles or aunts or cousins, or any family besides Grandmom. When he asked her, though, she always shrugged and gave him the same answer. "Your grandfather and I had the one child. Your father was not a strong boy. He was sick, often like you are, and we were afraid to have another. By the time he was old enough to over his sickness, your grandfather was dead, and it was only me and your father." That made Charlie feel a little better. His father had been like him in that sense, sickly and alone with his grandmom, so it couldn't be that strange. That didn't stop the other kids from teasing him, though. I remember Charlie when he first arrived at school, and the other kids had him pegged as an oddball from the get-go. Going to school in the early 90s, it was all about how cool you were, how many cool things you had on your clothes. Charlie showed up the first day of school looking like the boy from the hot chocolate box my mom always bought. He wore suspenders and stockings, knee boots, and shirts with weird fringes on them. He stuck out like a sore thumb. This, mixed with his funny way of talking and his stunted knowledge base, made the other kids think he was slow and kind of a dweeb. He came in for quite a bit of ridicule, and I recall it was a hard couple of days before my friends and I got involved. This is where I come into Charlie's story, I guess. I had never taken part in the teasing, and over time I began to feel bad for him. I pushed some of my friends to invite him to play with us, and we were surprised to find not a dumb kid, but an imaginative kid, who joined in our games eagerly. His grandmom, had taught him a little Russian, which we thought was just the coolest, and we gave him some of our old clothes to wear so he didn't stand out quite so much. Together, we played G.I. Joes or superheroes or whatever the game of the day happened to be, and outside of play, we helped Charlie stand up for himself and make the bully stop. As we got older, Charlie stayed at our place a lot, and we really helped him come out of his shell and adapt to life outside of Grandmom's house. We were friends with Charlie all the way through high school, and after high school, we all thought we might get an apartment together. Zach, Tristan, Charlie, and I, so we could attend college together. Charlie was hesitant. He didn't want to leave his poor old grandmom alone in the middle of the woods. So when he turned up at the house a few days later with a scant few possessions, I was pretty surprised. He had 2 plastic bags of clothes, a zipper bag of toiletries. After some coaxing, he told me he and his grandmom had had a really nasty fight. This surprised me, because I'd never heard of Charlie's grandmom ever raising her voice to him in all the time I'd known him. And he seemed just as shocked about the outburst as we were. She had refused to give him any of his stuff, except what he'd brought with him, and told him not to expect her to send him money or anything else. If he moved out now, he was on his own. You could tell how upset he was, poor guy, and we helped him out as best we could. He ended up sleeping on my couch until his first Pell check came in, and after that, he just kinda made do. I had expected that would be the end of his closeness with his grandma, but I couldn't have been more wrong. After a few weeks of silence, she went back to calling him every day, and to our astonishment, he made plans to have dinner with her and help her with her shopping. She would send him money sometimes, and he would go over several days a week to eat dinner or lunch, and slowly things began to return to normal. She still wouldn't let him take any of his stuff out of her house, but he got some new stuff, and by the time his first semester was done, he had everything that he needed. Things went on in this way for about 3 years, at least until last Wednesday. Charlie and I had just got back from class when he got a call from his grandma. His face fell as they talked, and you could tell that Charlie was barely holding back tears. She hadn't been doing well for several years, nearly from the time Charlie moved out, and I personally thought it was a guilt trip to keep her grandson close to home, though I'd never say as much to Charlie. He talked to her for a few minutes and then immediately went to his room and packed an overnight bag. He told me to tell his counselor that he had a family emergency and needed to go home to be with his grandmother. When I asked him what was going on, he told me that she was dying and she wanted him to stay with her until she passed. I commiserated with him and told him to give her my best and to stay in contact so we knew when he'd be back. That was a week ago, and it was the last time anyone has ever seen or heard from Charlie. His car is gone, his things are gone from his room, and Charlie has disappeared without a trace. I drove the hour to his grandmother's house, hoping to find some clues when I got there, only to be greeted by a stranger when the door opened. She was a tall, dark-haired woman with lank hair and a swollen, pregnant belly, and she was no one I had ever seen before. Yeah, hell, Charlie and his grandma were the only 2 people I'd ever seen at the house before now. She claimed to be a distant relative that had inherited the house from Charlie's grandmother when she died. She didn't seem to speak English very well, and was completely unsure as to who Charlie was or where he had gone to. We quickly lost patience with each other, and she yelled at me to leave before she called the authorities. I seethed all the way home, but I couldn't get any answers out of her. I got my answers last night. It was around 2 a.m. in the morning when something woke me up from a deep sleep. My legs were full of pins and felt like someone was sitting on them. I rolled over, thinking one of my roommates had wandered in drunk, only to find Charlie sitting on my bed. Even in the dim light, I could tell something was wrong. Charlie looked bad, withered somehow, like a grape that gets left in the crisper drawer for too long. Or a corpse after it's dried out in a grave. He spoke to me, his voice a rattling rasp in my ears, and told me that something had happened. He'd gone to be with his grandmom. He found her on her deathbed, and she'd reached for him with her withered arms when he'd come in. He'd slumped, weeping by her bedside, and she'd reached out with her wrinkled hands and touched his face. He looked at her, and she had asked him to put his forehead against hers, so she could say the words one last time. She was my grandmom, and I loved her. How could I deny her anything? He said, his voice racked with pain. So he let her draw his face to hers, and she said the old familiar words as she always had. Always together, even when apart. Always a part of me, here in my heart. But when she kissed him on the forehead, his lips already starting to ask what it meant, he felt something strange. It was like she was taking everything from me. My breath, my blood, my bones, my seed, and all with that single kiss on my forehead. As she had taken all of it from him, he had crumpled up into a dried husk as she changed before his eyes. Her hair darkened, her skin tightened, her eyes sparkled, and he said that her belly had grown large even as her breasts grew heavy with milk. When she stood over him, she was 50 years younger, a girl of 20, and I realized that she was the woman who had opened the door for me. She stood over him, cackling at his desiccated form, and her face was devoid of the love that had always been there. Now you see why I have kept you close all these years. Now you'll see the fruit of my labor, just as your father did before you and your grandfather before him, she said, looking down at Charlie without pity or remorse. Why? He asked huskily, his voice dry as a desert. Why have you done this? Why? This is the state that befalls all your line. Males for centuries and centuries. Males from the first of your name to crawl upon this earth. He told me I was ugly. He spat on my love, and he promised me that I would never have him. I promised him that I would have all of his line, bear them and break them. So I have from that time on. Your son, she said, and gave her belly a little stroke, will be no different. And as she stood cackling over him, Charlie died and passed into the void that waits beyond. He told me all of this as I sat huddled by the head of my bed, but promised me that she was wrong. She would have no more from his line. The cycle would end with his son. He told me some things he understood now, and called his grandmother a vedma, which is the Russian word for witch. He also called her a strigoi, but he hopes he's wrong about that. A mortal man may kill a vedma if he is very lucky, he told me, but a strigoi is another matter entirely. He made me promise if I ever called him friend, to rescue my son and kill his grandmom, once and for all. It will be dark soon, and he says that tonight will be the night of her delivery, which will make her weak. I'm leaving this here just in case I don't come back, in case someone out there might save Charlie's son if I fail. I have the things I need, and midnight will be here before I know it. I hope I'm strong enough to do what must be done. I pray I don't come to my friends in the night with a similar request. I pray that I can break this curse and make Charlie its last victim.